The gas station was mostly empty, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as Malcolm Tate pulled the hood of his sweatshirt over his head and stepped inside. The air carried the stale scent of cheap coffee and motor oil, the kind of place where truckers stopped for fuel and night shift workers grabbed a quick snack before heading home. He walked straight to the counter, his boots heavy against the tile. 12 years in the Marines had left him with habits he couldn't shake, standing tall, scanning the room without thinking, always aware of the exits. But tonight, he just wanted to grab his coffee and get home. The cashier, a young kid with dark circles under his eyes, barely looked up as Malcolm placed a $5 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," Malcolm muttered, grabbing his cup and turning toward the door. That's when he saw them. The squad car, the flashing blue and red reflecting against the glass windows. His stomach tightened. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you." Now back to the story. Outside, Officer Ray Danning leaned against the hood of his patrol car, arms crossed, eyes locked on Malcolm like he was already guilty of something. Malcolm let out a slow breath. He knew men like Danning, the kind that didn't need a reason, the kind that saw a black man in a hoodie and assumed the worst. But he wasn't about to let this turn into something it didn't need to be. He pushed the door open, stepping into the cold night air, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't stupid. He knew how quickly things could spiral. "Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, demanding. Malcolm turned, coffee still in hand. "Something I can help you with, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Danning smirked, the kind of smirk that made Malcolm's fists itch. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." Malcolm tensed, that old excuse. "What description is that?" he asked, voice calm. Danning took a step closer. Black male, medium build, wearing a hoodie. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "That's half the damn city." Danning's smirk didn't budge. "License and registration." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "I'm not in a car." Danning shrugged, eyes glinting with something dangerous. "Then let's start with your ID." Malcolm had a choice here. Push back, demand to know why he was being stopped, or play along and hope Danning didn't escalate. He reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate, pulling out his wallet. His fingers found the worn leather of his military ID, the same one he had carried since boot camp. He handed it over. Danning took it, eyes scanning the plastic card. The moment he saw U.S. Marine Corps stamped on the bottom, his smirk faltered. For a split second, Malcolm saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, hesitation. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Danning tossed the ID back, letting it fall to the pavement. Malcolm didn't move. He felt his pulse hammering in his skull, felt the heat crawl up his spine. But he wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing him snap. "You're gonna want to pick that up," Danning said, stepping closer. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "You can hand it back like a professional." Danning let out a short laugh. "Oh, you one of those?" Malcolm didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, a thin wire pulled tight, ready to snap. And then, just like that, Danning made his move. He grabbed Malcolm's arm, twisting it behind his back, shoving him forward against the side of the patrol car. "Hey, what the hell?" "Stop resisting," Danning barked, yanking the other arm back, his grip like a vice. Malcolm's coffee hit the ground, the lid popping off, dark liquid spilling across the pavement. The world tilted. His body screamed at him to react, to fight back, to defend himself. But he knew how that would end, so he locked his muscles, gritted his teeth, and didn't fight. Danning leaned in, voice low. "Not so tough now, huh?" Then, a voice cut through the air. "I'm recording this." Danning hesitated. Malcolm turned his head just enough to see. A young woman, phone held high, camera rolling. "Y'all see this?" she shouted. "This man did nothing, and this cop's got him in cuffs." More voices joined in. Other people at the gas station were watching now, stepping closer. And just like that, the power shifted. Danning's hand tightened on Malcolm's wrist, but now he was hesitating. Because now, the world was watching. Malcolm felt it, the way the control had slipped from Danning's fingers the moment that camera started rolling. This wasn't just another night. This wasn't just another arrest. This was going to be a problem. For Danning, not for him. As Malcolm sat in the back of the squad car, the phone still recording, he knew one thing for certain. By the time the sun came up, the world would know exactly what happened here tonight. And this time, it wasn't his reputation on the line. It was theirs. The metal bench in the holding cell was cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. Malcolm Tate sat with his back against the cinder block wall, hands resting on his knees, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was easy. Anger was what men like Officer Ray Danning expected. No, Malcolm wasn't angry. He was calculating. The station was quieter than he expected. No one had come in to question him. No one had even spoken to him since they threw him in the holding cell. That told him one thing. They were scrambling. And scrambling meant they knew they had screwed up. Across the station, past the glass divider, Danning was pacing. His fingers drummed against his belt, his jaw tight, eyes flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. Malcolm had seen that look before. Not confidence, but panic disguised as control. The door swung open, and Detective Sarah Knox walked in. She was tall, sharp-featured, with eyes that missed nothing. A woman who had spent years in this department, watching men like Danning get away with everything. She didn't look at Malcolm right away. She went straight to the duty sergeant behind the desk, voice low but firm. "Where's the report?" The sergeant, a younger guy who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, hesitated before pulling out a file. He handed it over, but Malcolm could see it from where he sat. It was thin. Too thin. Knox flipped it open. No probable cause? No resisting? Then why the hell is he in a cell? Danning stepped forward, trying to mask his nerves with arrogance. He got aggressive, looked like he was about to run. Knox didn't even look at him. "Where's the footage?" Danning opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another door opened. A voice cut through the tension. "I got it right here." All eyes turned to the young woman from the gas station, Lisa Carter. She walked in like she belonged there, phone in hand, her chin lifted. Behind her was Jordan Ellis, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for making departments like this crumble. Malcolm almost smiled. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." Almost smiled, Lisa held up her phone, tapping the screen. The video played loud and clear, the entire room forced to hear the words Danning had thrown at Malcolm. The moment he twisted his arm, the second he slammed him against the car for no reason. The duty sergeant shifted uncomfortably. Knox's lips pressed into a thin line. Danning? Danning looked like a man who had just realized he was in the deep end and the tide was rising fast. Jordan stepped forward, placing a thick file on the desk. "Mr. Tate is a decorated Marine. He's never had so much as a parking ticket," she said, her voice sharp. "And yet, here he is, sitting in a cell for no reason other than Officer Danning wanted to throw his weight around." Knox finally turned to Malcolm, exhaling before nodding toward the door. "You're free to go, Mr. Tate." Danning whirled on her. "Are you serious?" Knox's gaze was icy. "Do you have probable cause? A valid arrest report? Anything to justify why you put a man in cuffs for buying coffee?" Danning clenched his fists but said nothing. Knox smirked. "That's what I thought." The lock clicked and Malcolm stepped out of the cell, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the phantom weight of the cuffs. He turned to Lisa, nodding. "Thanks." She grinned. "No problem. Someone had to do something." Jordan adjusted her blazer. "Oh, we're just getting started." She looked at Knox. "I'm filing a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, and we'll be seeing the department in court for unlawful detainment." Danning scoffed. "You're joking, right?" Malcolm finally spoke up, stepping close enough that Danning had to look up at him. "You made a mistake," Malcolm said, voice calm. "And now, you're going to answer for it." Danning didn't move, didn't blink. Malcolm didn't need to say anything else, because the tables had already turned. And this was just the beginning. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing as Malcolm Tate walked through the heavy wooden doors, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He hadn't wanted this fight, not at first. But now that he was in it, he was going to make damn sure no one else had to go through what he did. Outside, the streets were alive with protesters. Signs with bold letters read, "Justice for Malcolm" and "Veterans deserve better." It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black man who had been thrown into the system for nothing. Every veteran who had come home only to find himself treated like a threat in his own country. Inside, Jordan Ellis sat beside him at the plaintiff's table, flipping through pages of notes with the calm of a woman who had already won. Across from them, Officer Ray Danning sat rigid in his chair, his lawyer whispering in his ear, his jaw locked. He wasn't smiling now. Judge Wilson, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, called the courtroom to order. The murmurs died down. Jordan stood first, buttoning her blazer as she approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice measured, designed to make every single word count. "You've all seen the video. You've seen my client, Malcolm Tate, a man who served this country with honor, thrown against a squad car like a common criminal. You've heard the officer's words. You've seen the aggression. And most importantly, you've seen that Mr. Tate did absolutely nothing wrong." She let the weight of that statement settle before she continued. "This case isn't about one bad cop. This case is about a system that allows men like Officer Danning to act with impunity. It's about a man who abused his power, who saw a black veteran and didn't see a hero. He saw a threat." The jury was hooked. The room was silent, hanging on to every syllable. Danning's lawyer stood next, adjusting his tie. He tried to argue that Danning was simply doing his job, that Malcolm's body language seemed aggressive, that Danning had reasonable suspicion. Jordan let him talk. Then she stood again. She walked to the center of the courtroom and clicked the remote in her hand. The screen at the front lit up, playing the full video of Malcolm's arrest, the gas station parking lot, the moment Danning approached, the sneer on his face when he saw the military ID. The words played loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Think that makes you special?" The jury shifted uncomfortably. Respect is earned, and right now, I don't see much to respect. The video kept playing, the twist of Malcolm's arm, the slam against the squad car, the camera shaking as Lisa Carter's voice rang out. "You're arresting a veteran for nothing." When the video ended, Jordan let the silence stretch. Then she turned to the jury. "Officer Danning says he was doing his job." She gestured toward the screen. "Does that look like justice to you?" The courtroom was stone silent, and in that moment, Malcolm knew they had won. The ruling came faster than expected. The jury found in Malcolm's favor, awarding him damages for wrongful arrest, civil rights violations, and emotional distress. Danning? He wasn't just fired. The Department of Justice announced an independent investigation into his history of racial profiling and misconduct. The fallout was immediate. The police chief was forced to issue a public apology, promising sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training, and stricter oversight. Malcolm stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the press swarming, microphones shoved in his face. But it wasn't Malcolm who spoke first. Lisa Carter stepped forward, lifting her phone toward the cameras. "This video started something," she said, "but this fight isn't over. It doesn't end just because Malcolm got justice. We keep pushing until it stops happening to anyone else." The crowd cheered. Malcolm looked at Jordan. "Think they'll actually follow through?" Jordan smirked. "They don't have a choice." Malcolm exhaled, turning to face the crowd. He had never wanted to be the face of a movement, but now that he was here, he wasn't backing down. The city had changed, not in an instant, not overnight, but the shift was undeniable. Malcolm Tate walked down the steps of the courthouse, his face impassive as the roar of the crowd surged around him. He could hear the chanting, the cheers, the reporters shouting questions, but none of it shook him. He had faced war zones, had stared down men who wanted him dead. A swarm of reporters? That was nothing. At his side, Jordan Ellis kept her posture straight, her eyes sharp and knowing. They had won. The verdict was clear. Officer Ray Danning was finished. The police department had been forced to acknowledge its corruption, and the city was already beginning the process of police reform. But Malcolm knew better than to think this was the end of the fight, because battles didn't just end when the war was still raging. A microphone was shoved toward him. "Mr. Tate, now that you've won your case, do you feel like justice has been served?" He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the mass of cameras, microphones, and expectant faces. Justice. The word felt hollow. Justice would have been not getting arrested in the first place. Justice would have been walking home from the gas station without being slammed against a squad car. Justice would have been not having to fight for something that should have been a given. "No," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Justice hasn't been served." A hush fell over the crowd. Even Jordan turned her head slightly, curious as to where he was going with this. "I won a lawsuit," he continued. "That doesn't change the fact that there are hundreds, thousands of men and women out there who don't have a camera recording when it happens to them, who don't have a high-powered lawyer to stand beside them, who don't get to walk out of a courtroom with their name cleared." Reporters leaned in closer. The protesters in the crowd quieted. "This isn't justice," Malcolm said. "This is just the beginning." 3 weeks later, Malcolm sat at the head of a long table inside a sleek, modern office in the heart of downtown. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat veterans advocates, civil rights leaders, and community organizers, all of them waiting for him to speak. Lisa Carter, the woman who had filmed his arrest, sat near the end, tapping at her laptop, already working on the next social media campaign. Jordan Ellis leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. He exhaled, running his hand over the grain of the table. "The way I see it, we have two options," he said. "We take our victory and walk away, or we use it as leverage to make sure this never happens again." Logan Myers, one of Malcolm's oldest friends from the Marine Corps, crossed his arms. "What are you proposing?" Malcolm looked up. "The Tate Initiative." A murmur passed around the table. Jordan's brow lifted. "And what exactly would this initiative do?" Malcolm laced his fingers together, his voice firm. "It's going to do what the system refuses to," he said. "We're going to build something for veterans: legal aid, job placement, housing assistance, mental health support, and we're going to push for national policies that hold police accountable when they target us." Lisa nodded. "A nationwide campaign?" "Not just a campaign," Malcolm said. "A movement." He glanced at Jordan. "You in?" She smirked. "Oh, I thought you'd never ask." The first Tate Initiative Center opened 6 months later. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't corporate. It was built inside an old repurposed community center, painted fresh with walls lined with resources for veterans in need. On the first day, hundreds of people showed up, some looking for help, others looking to offer it. Malcolm stood at the entrance, shaking hands with old veterans, greeting young men and women who had been in the same place he was. Lisa moved through the crowd, live streaming the event. Jordan was already talking to a senator who had stopped by to pledge support. Logan clapped Malcolm on the shoulder. "Didn't peg you for a politician." Malcolm chuckled. "I'm not one." Logan gestured to the growing crowd. "Could have fooled me." Malcolm looked around, watching as men and women who had been ignored for too long finally had a place to turn. This wasn't justice. This was the real fight. And this time, he wasn't fighting it alone. The news anchor's voice played over the screen. In the wake of the landmark case against the police department, the Tate Initiative has expanded to over a dozen cities, offering legal aid and support to veterans and individuals facing racial profiling. Malcolm Tate, once an unlikely activist, has become a national voice in the fight for criminal justice reform. The television clicked off. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. Across from him, Jordan smirked. "You're famous now?" Malcolm scoffed. "I didn't ask to be." "No," Jordan said, "but sometimes the fight finds you whether you want it or not." Malcolm exhaled. He looked out the window at the city that had once tried to break him. Now it was his to protect. And he would. For every veteran, for every man and woman who had ever been silenced, for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves. This wasn't a battle. This was a war, and Malcolm Tate was ready.